They showed up one morning with a letter that felt more like a threat than a notice. My 75-year-old mom, who had spent decades tending her garden, nurturing every flower and vegetable like a piece of her heart, suddenly faced a demand she couldn't ignore, tear it all down, or face consequences she hadn't imagined. The garden wasn't just plants. It was her sanctuary, her legacy, the last piece of peace after years of hardship. And now some faceless authority thought they could take it away. But how far would she go to fight back? And what would happen when ordinary rules collided with extraordinary courage? Life in our quiet little neighborhood had always followed a gentle rhythm. Morning light spilled over neatly trimmed lawns, the faint scent of freshly mown grass drifting through the air. My mother, a woman of 75 with hands weathered from decades of care and work, spent most of her days in her garden, a small but vibrant patch tucked behind our modest home. Roses climbed along the trellis, daisies bobbed in the breeze, and rows of vegetables grew in tidy lines, each plant a testament to patience, love, and a lifetime of quiet dedication. To anyone passing by, it was just a beautiful garden. To her, it was everything. It was where she had found solace after losing my father, a place to pour her grief into life rather than sorrow. Every morning, she tended her flowers with care, humming softly, her small routines weaving peace into the fabric of our days. Neighbors often waved or stopped briefly, complimenting the blooms or sneaking a quick peek at her latest tomato plants. Life was simple. Life was safe. But there were whispers, small and seemingly harmless, that hinted at a different reality. A neighbor would frown as she pruned her rose bushes, muttering about community standards or proper appearance. Notes left anonymously on the mailbox hinted that some people in the neighborhood didn't like things that didn't fit their idea of perfection. I never thought much of it. Rules were rules, after all. But underneath those polite gestures and tiny criticisms, a storm was quietly gathering, one that would soon demand more than we ever imagined. No one in our family could foresee that the very place that gave Mom her strength, the garden that carried the memory of a lifetime, would become the center of a battle with people who saw control as their right and compassion as weakness. One ordinary morning, a letter arrived that would change everything, and with it, an ordinary life would shatter, revealing just how fragile peace can be when power and rules collide. The first letter had been alarming, but it felt almost like a misunderstanding. We thought perhaps someone had made a clerical error, or maybe the HOA would realize that my mother's garden posed no real threat to the community. But it didn't take long for reality to hit. Days later, another envelope arrived, heavier this time, stamped with the unmistakable authority of the HOA. My hands shook as I read the words aloud. A fine. $250 per day if the garden was not removed. The number burned itself into my mind, climbing with each imagined day, each flower my mother refused to surrender. My mother's hands trembled as she held the letter, not from fear of the money, but from the weight of the implication. They weren't asking her to comply. They were demanding it, and they had a way of making it feel like disobedience was both shameful and dangerous. This garden, her sanctuary, her source of solace after years of grief, was now a weapon in someone else's battle for control. The neighbors were split. Some shook their heads when they saw us outside, holding the letters, muttering about rules and keeping the peace. Others, we realized, quietly sympathized but dared not intervene. Fear had woven itself into the community as tightly as my mother had woven her flowers into the soil. One afternoon, Mrs. Keller, a neighbor whose rose bushes had been repeatedly targeted in the past, stopped by. Her eyes were sharp, tinged with a mixture of pity and anger. She whispered of selective enforcement, of power being wielded not to protect, but to intimidate. We realized the fight would not be a simple one. It was not just about flowers or aesthetics or even rules written on paper. It was about asserting control, and they had the advantage of procedure, bureaucracy, and the willingness to punish without explanation. Letters piled up, threats, fines, demands for compliance, citations that seemed arbitrarily applied. Every time we thought it might end, another note arrived. Each one chipped away at the sense of normalcy my mother had clung to for years. Despite the mounting pressure, my mother refused to yield. She spent hours in the garden each day, her hands deep in the soil, her body bent with purpose. I watched her move through rows of tomatoes, marigolds, and lavender, her determination as tangible as the sun beating down on her shoulders. She refused to remove a single plant. The HOA's insistence became almost absurd, an obsession with control over beauty and life itself. And yet, for all their rigidity, they never explained which specific rule had been violated. It was power without accountability, a force wielded arbitrarily, like a shadow pressing down on the heart of someone who had already endured too much. We began documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every whispered comment from a neighbor. The absurdity was staggering. One letter claimed the roses were non-compliant with community standards, though we later discovered dozens of neighbors had identical bushes in full bloom, untouched. Another demanded removal of vegetables because they constituted an unapproved landscaping feature, though the front yards of several homes were lined with decorative shrubs in precisely the same arrangement. The contradictions were glaring, but the HOA was relentless. Even small victories felt impossible. Attempts to negotiate were met with curt replies. Phone calls ended abruptly. Emails were answered with boilerplate statements. It seemed they took no joy in fairness, only in compliance. Yet my mother's resolve grew stronger each day. She would kneel in the garden, hands pressed against the soil, whispering to the plants as if they could hear her promise. They would not take this from her. The plants became a symbol, a battleground, and a testament to her refusal to be bullied. The community began to stir. Some neighbors, once fearful, watched with growing curiosity. We heard whispers of others who had suffered similar treatment, quiet stories of petty fines and arbitrary enforcement. These accounts painted a picture that was no longer just about one garden, but about a pattern of harassment. The HOA president, a woman whose presence was both commanding and cold, seemed to single out residents for reasons no one could clearly articulate. The more we learned, the more it became apparent that this was about power, not rules.